Sergei Eisenstein was probably the most influential single artist in the history of Soviet and later Russian and honestly the entirety of world filmmaking. The way he framed and edited specific types of shots later influenced many Russian films and many Western films as well that became absolute classics. In general, the theory of montage has had at least some influence throughout pretty much all of cinema that came after it. Sergei Mikhailovich Eisenstein was born on the 22nd of January of 1898, 10th of January by the Julian calendar that was used in the Russian Empire at the time, in Riga, which is now the capital of Latvia but was at this time part of Russia. The son of a Jewish-Swedish architect father and a Russian mother, he often moved around in his youth as his father looked for work. He grew up during an extremely tumultuous time in his country. The Russo-Japanese War and the 1905 Revolution both occurred when he was just a small child. He was obviously too young to fight in the First World War and went to university in Petrograd, which is now St. Petersburg, and was formerly known as Leningrad as well, to study architecture and engineering, but dropped out in 1918 to join the Red Army to fight the Russian Civil War despite his father supporting the Tsarist forces. He served as an engineer constructing fortifications as well as providing entertainment for troops. This turned out to be his true passion. He left the Red Army in 1920 to turn to theater. His first job in the entertainment industry was as set designer at the Parlikud Theater. Parlikud stands for Proletarian Cultural in Moscow, where he worked under a certain Vsevolod Meyerhold, who was an extremely influential avant-garde theater director who inspired a lot of Eisenstein's later ideas. His first film, Dnevnik Glumova, Glumov's Diary, was actually a part of a Parlikud production of an 1868 Ostrovsky play called Enough Stupidity in Every Wise Man, which included the scenes from Glumov's Diary intermittently with his onstage performances. His first full-length feature film, called Stachka, or Strike, was released in 1925, or 1924 according to some sources, it's very strange, and was met with critical acclaim from Soviet audiences. That same year, most likely, he created what was likely his most known work, Bronenосец Potemkin, known in English as Battleship Potemkin, about a rebellion on a Russian naval vessel that kickstarted the 1905 revolution. This film received critical acclaim from both Soviet and Western audiences, and its Odessa Steps sequence has been honored in many films since, and we will talk about that more in detail later. After his success with those two films, he was appointed to direct a film in honor of the 10th anniversary of the October Revolution, which is when the communists took power in 1917 in Russia, which took place in November, not in October. It's confusing. The documentary was called 10 дней, которые потрясли мир, or October, 10 Days That Shook the World. The film was received largely negatively because it was criticized for not actually being simple enough for the worker to understand who it was supposed to be meant for. It was considered too complex for its time. And after this failure, Eisenstein had to take a break from Soviet life, and he went on a tour of Europe. He went to Paris, London, Zurich, Rotterdam, and some other cities. But in 1930, while on tour, he was contracted very surprisingly by Jesse L. Lasky of Paramount Pictures to make a film in the United States. Eisenstein came to the US and almost began filming, even meeting Walt Disney, but was chased out of Hollywood by anti-communist agitators. Faced with a potentially disastrous return to the USSR, Eisenstein was able to secure funding from some investors, including Upton Sinclair, who was a very prominent American author with communist sympathies, to sponsor him to make a film in Mexico. Having secured the funding for the film and also an extension to his absence from the Soviet Union because of closed borders and all that, he traveled south to begin production. However, by his departure from the United States, there was no real plan for the film, and by the end of the agreed 4-month filming period, the film was not yet finished. So Eisenstein returned to the USSR, and Upton Sinclair and the other investors were left disappointed. Despite all this, from 170,000 to 250,000 feet of film had been shot, about 30 to 50 hours. But with Eisenstein no longer able to edit this footage, and Soviet authorities not allowing it to get to him for him to actually be able to edit it, several other people attempted to do so, largely without much success. And it was released in 1932 and 1933 with different editing, but it wasn't that great. It was later edited by Eisenstein's companion Grigory Alexandrov, shown earlier in the picture with Walt Disney, but it still wasn't likely what Eisenstein had envisioned. Eisenstein returned to the USSR in 1933 after a stint in Mexico, and for a short period of time suffered from depression due to not being able to actually edit the footage. This is assumed, we don't know actually for sure, but this is very likely. However, in 1935, he was contacted by the Komsomol, the Communist Youth League, to create a film based on partially fabricated Soviet propaganda legend of Pavlik Morozov. The film was, however, once again hampered by massive production issues, and Einstein's instructions didn't fit well with the message of socialist realism the government enforced Soviet artistic style. The film was repressed during Stalin's Great Purge, and Eisenstein could have had effectively via a miracle. This miracle being that Stalin decided to blame the producers instead of the directors for the film's mishaps. Despite the film's failure, Eisenstein was given a second chance. And that second chance was Alexander Nevsky, which is probably his most famous work within Russia. It is a film so powerful that it has actually created massive historical misconceptions that are still very prevalent with its artistic and narrative choices. The film is about the invasion of the Principality of Novgorod by German Teutonic Crusader forces in the year 1242. One of the film's greatest scenes is that of the Crusaders in the ancient city of Pskov. The scene portrays the burning remains of the city of Pskov as the people within them are massacred by the Teutons. Ominous music, as sound films had merged at this point. There were sound in films now. So Eisenstein was able to add music with the help of Sergei Eisenstein, who was a prominent Soviet director. Alexander Nevsky was Eisenstein's big redemption. Its massive scene on the Battle of the Ice was a major hit and inspired a lot of Soviet cavalry battles in later films, such as in Неуловимые мстители, The Elusive Avengers, which is an adventure movie from the 70s, which is one of my personal favorites. It was a massive success, Alexander Nevsky, and was seen by millions before it was very suddenly pulled from theaters following the German-Soviet alliance known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in 1939. The film was very rapidly put back into theaters in 1941 following the German betrayal of that pact and invasion of the Soviet Union on June 22nd, 1941. The film's success allowed Eisenstein to get a place back in the favor of the Soviet elite. In 1942, he was contracted to make a film about the notable Russian Tsar Ivan the Terrible in 3 parts. The first part was a success, released in 1945, but the second part was disliked by Stalin because it portrayed Ivan the Terrible as a bit more authoritarian and similar to style, and he repressed it until it was finally released in 1958 after Stalin's death and subsequent de-Stalinization. After this failure, Eisenstein fell into depression, and largely possibly due to him not being able to finish, again, his creative work for the part 3 of Ivan the Terrible, which was never finished. After this failure, he fell into depression and then suffered a fatal heart attack in February of 1948. To understand Eisenstein's influence in film, we will take a look at probably his most famous scene, the Odessa steppe scene in Battleship Potemkin. The sequence opens with a montage of people from the city of Odessa coming out on boats to the battleship Potemkin, which has overthrown its officers and on which the sailors have taken control. All is well. People were celebrating and watching from the massive staircase in Odessa harbor called the Potemkin Steps. All of a sudden, the mood changes completely, and everyone begins to panic and rush down the stairs. Tsarist soldiers have come to shoot down all those who support the revolt, as on the bottom of the stairs, Cossacks on horseback cut down those who run from the soldiers on top. The sequence features innovative techniques such as a POV shot, which is rather unheard of at this point, and really zoomed in close-up the shots make people's reaction fill up the entire screen and really feel more enlarged and important. A child is trampled up in the stampede after he is shot, and the mother carries him up to the soldiers in an act of desperation, with cuts and editing going everywhere. Goes back to the mother's face, to the child, to the soldiers, to bystanders, and back to the child away. Again, the most iconic image of the sequence is the extreme close-up, the face of an elderly woman with one broken eyeglass and blood running out of her eye. But the real highlight of the scene is the montage of the stroller running down the stairs. As the woman who was pushing the stroller down the stairs trying to get away from the soldier is shot and presumably killed, she pushes over to the stroller as she falls, and it begins to slowly make its way down the steps. Shots of the stroller seemingly serenely rolling down the steps are intermittent with scenes of horrible violence and brutality. This whole scene with the straw is a perfect example of Eisenstein's theory of montage, and is excellently capped off via the scene being cut up just when a mountain soldier is about to strike someone below him who we do not see, and before the stroller completes its descent. Sergei Eisenstein was most certainly a man of his time. He was undoubtedly forged by the massive social unrest of his time, socialist ideals, avant-garde ideals, the Russian Civil War, other conflicts around the time. But he was a man who was also extremely unique in his time. He was one of the first truly prominent Soviet film directors, the only, not really anybody is able to be compared to him. He's kind of an enigma within Soviet culture and the Soviet film, especially early Soviet film.